Okay, magandang araw po sa inyo lahat. Ako po si Christian Esguera and welcome po sa ating special Facts First episode or podcast about, of course, Ibang Samoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao. Doon po sa mga talagang matagal na pong sumusubaybay dito po sa ating podcast. Ilagay ko pong binabanggit, isa po sa mga issues na hindi po natin bibitawan ay ito pong mga nangyayaring developments dyan po sa Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao or BARMM. Now, bakit po tayo meron ganitong episode ngayon? Meron po kasing isang, I would call it a groundbreaking study, providing an honest review of the 6-year transition dyan po sa BARMM. Of course, we know that there was this transition from the autonomous region in Muslim Mindanao, papunta po dito sa tinatawag na BARMM. Okay? Okay. So, we're going to talk about this very important study covering 6 years of transition because you know na medyo nadali na po itong supposed very first parliamentary elections in that region. So, ito po yung pag-uusapan natin. So, we have here the two authors of this groundbreaking study. Okay? Ang title po ng kanilang study, of course, ay The Bangsamoro Transition Authority and the Forging of an Autonomous Regional Government in Muslim Mindanao. A review of the 6-year BARMM transition. Okay? Papakilala ko po muna ang ating mga special na panauhin for today. Okay? First, I'd like to welcome to our program si Mr. David Timberman. He's an American researcher and development practitioner with 40 years of experience addressing political and governance challenges in Southeast Asia, and particularly, of course, the Philippines. Next, we have Yasmira Moner. She is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science and the current director of the Gender and Development Center at the Mindanao State University, Iligan Institute of Technology. Okay? Good morning, good evening, guys, and thank you for joining us here on Facts First for the first time. Hi, David. Hi, Yash.
Good morning, Christian. Hi, Yash.
Hi everyone. Assalamualaikum.
Okay, by the way, for those who are watching or listening to this podcast, David is in New York, so it's evening there. Okay, let's start with this very important study. To me, this is very important for us to have an honest assessment of the transition so far. Okay, so talk to us briefly about what brought about this study, why initiate this at this time, and how important this is for the Bangsamoro peace process. Perhaps we can start with David.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Christian. And I'll jump in first and then let Yash add to what I've got to say. Well, we thought we started working on this report over a year ago. So it actually hasn't been keyed to, the upcoming elections, just to be very clear about that. And we thought it was important to look at the BTA, the Bangsamoro Transition Authority, as a governing entity, not just as a piece of the still unfinished peace process. So, we wanted to take a look at how it has functioned as a government, and it's a very particular kind of government in the Philippines, right? It's a transitional government, and it's transitional both for the actors within the BTA, but also for everybody else in the region. It's transitional for the traditional elites in the region because it's a new situation. They're dealing with a different type of government. It's transitional for different groups in the region. So it's a very fluid, dynamic, changing situation. So the transitional dimension was very important. But then, of course, at the heart of this, it's an autonomous government, or at least to some extent it is autonomous. We can get into that, I suppose. And then it is a regional government, which is to say that it's situated between the national level government and local government units. So it's not quite, but almost unique in that regard in the Philippines. So those three elements of it make it both very complex and very interesting to look at, but also very, very challenging for all of the people who actually have to make it work. So those are some of the reasons.
Okay, before Yash jumps in, perhaps you can also cover
Mhm.
the
Yeah.
metrics used in terms of assessing the different facets of the transition. Go ahead.
Yeah. So basically, like at least institutionally with the legislation of the Bangsamoro Organic Law, we can see that the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region really sets somehow a model in terms of certain political reforms that we are wishing to be adopted nationally. Like, for instance, a party-based political system. The original government structure in the BARMM is actually parliamentary, where it is supposed to be centered on principled and party-based politics, the ban on political dynasties. So these particular political reforms that are part of the institutional mechanisms that have been institutionalized in the BARM is something that we also wanted to probe in this report. And as pointed out by David, so much has been talked about the BARM as a product of a peace process, and we believe that more than just seeing it as a product of a long journey to peace, we also need to see it as a governing entity that will set the precedence for the rest of the country. Thank you.
Okay,
And
so
so, yeah.
before I go to the of how the BTA is faring so far as a regional government,
Yeah.
I'd like to be clarified regarding the metrics in terms of assessing the successes, failures, or perhaps challenges confronting the transition government so far.
Okay.
Yeah, perhaps David or
Ed,
Yash.
would you
Sure.
like to start? Yeah.
David. Okay.
Sure. So to be very clear, this is a largely qualitative in academic terms. It's principally a qualitative assessment, not a quantitative assessment. So it's based mostly on interviews and mostly on um, careful review of documents that are available, and a little bit of survey work that was made available to us. Um, but there isn't a whole lot. There is some, but there isn't a whole lot of actual quantitative data, in terms of programs and outcomes and that sort of thing. So what we did was the sort of criteria we used, or one, what has the MILF and the BTA leadership said that they wanted to accomplish, during the transition period. So that was one important criterion. Second one, or another metric, is what's in the Bangsamoro Organic Law. That's a very important metric because the BOL mandates a number of different things that the transitional authority should do. So that's another important metric. Another important metric is sort of the extent to which we could gauge what people's expectations have been for the BTA. So those would be three of the most important ones.
Okay, let's talk about the expectations, and perhaps this is the first logical question. How have this been? How have these former rebels been faring in terms of actually running the show, running the bureaucracy so far, based on your assessment? Yash, perhaps you may start.
Well, as we've already pointed out in the report, that to the credit of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, being the government of the day, that they have institutionalized six of the firstly, they have institutionalized one of the priority legislations, six of the seven priority codes, which are very important to run the government. Second, they were able to establish the bureaucracy, which is an expanded version of the defunct arm. Third is that they have somehow introduced moral governance, although it is clear in the report that it doesn't mean that you have that on paper that is actually working. And clearly, moral governance is insufficient. So that's clear in the report as well. And that the fact that they were able to handle the pandemic, the crisis during their time is a success indicator. But I think I would now call David to further add on this, is because there are also a lot of challenges that needs to be filled in. So Dave, over to
Okay,
you.
go ahead, David.
Thanks. So, how have they? How has the BTA leader done? Yeah, I mean that's obviously the focus of this report, and it's. But I think even before asking that question, well, or to actually answer that question well, you also have to. I think it's important for Filipinos and for the international community to understand just how challenging it is to make. Well, I would make the point as somebody who looks at Philippine politics nationally as well. I mean, look how challenging it is to have good governance in the Philippines in general, right? And then look at how challenging it is to have good governance, even more so down in the Bangsamoro autonomous region, right? And so, there are, as Yash started to say, I mean, the BTA faced, at its inception, it came in, it inherited the Marawi crisis, right? Then it faced the COVID pandemic. Then and it's had to navigate changes in presidential administrations and national elections. So there are, and then you add to that just how complicated and violence prone politics are, in southern Mindanao. And so it's just a incredibly complicated and challenging situation. So in answering the question, how have they done? I mean, I think you have to begin with a recognition of how the challenges that they've faced. And as Yash has said, I mean, our judgment is that they've had a number of accomplishments. Just to add to the ones that she mentioned, they have it's a functioning government. It's not necessarily a well-functioning government, but it is the government that, I mean, there's some survey data that suggest it is the government that people down in the Bangsamoro region look to, as their the most important level of government, not local government, not national government. So the BARMM government itself, that's significant. It has, in addition to the 6 of the 7 laws mandated under the Bangsamoro Organic Law, there's a variety of other laws and institutions that they've set up. Again, how well they will function, it remains to be seen. But they've done that. They've done that heavy lift, and importantly, also they've, again, not without very significant problems, but they've also passed their budgets every year, and developed programs. Again, a lot of it problematic, but so they are, they have established themselves as a functioning government. And last point would be that, at least until recently, the MILF, which has led the government, has led the transition authority, has had to sort of, as it go through its own transition from rebels to rulers. And, that has its own set of challenges. And until very recently, well, there are now we're seeing greater strains on the unity with leadership within the MILF. But until recently, they had remained, at least moderately unified.
So basically, they were able to set up shop, set up the structures, despite all the challenges that you mentioned. But I remember during the devolution of many different national functions to the local governments in the Philippines during the 90s, one criticism was there are a lot of responsibilities given to the local governments without providing the necessary wherewithal. I like to juxtapose that in a way, in the case of the Bangsamoro. They were given a lot of responsibilities, and of course they were burdened unnecessarily or necessarily by heavy expectations. But were they given the proper resources, not just monetary but also in terms of capacity building? Perhaps Yash, and then David.
Well, that's something that we need to also we looked at in the report in terms of like the extent to how the BARMM was different or is different with the previous arm. For one, there is now fiscal autonomy, like the Black Grant, for instance, and the Special Development Fund, which is basically a fund as a catch-up fund because for such a long time, because of the armed conflict, Muslim Mindanao provinces lag behind the rest of the country. But you're right, because in the report, it was clear that there was really underspending. And there's a lot of factors that were mentioned in the report, but one of the things clearly was, for instance, the absorptive capacity. Like, for instance, in terms of the expanded bureaucracy in the BARMM, but you also have from the previous BARMM respective departments that are now merged in the BARMM. Say, for instance, the largest bureaucracy, which has its three counterparts at the national level: the Ministry of Basic, Higher, and Technical Education, which has three counterparts at the national, right? So in terms of like, how do you manage the transition to what was previously separate, while they could have like not mutual exclusive because their mandate is on education, but you need to also, of course, capacitate the employees that needs to be hired. Although, of course, in this case, one of the social services that was retained in terms of the employees are the social services, including education. But what is also mentioned in the report is that in terms of like the difficulty of really spending the budget, because like they have, for instance, the Ministry of Budget and finance, but then it's not like they're a separate state, that they still need to be responsible, and they need to have a fiscal prudence. And just like the rest of the country, where underspending is also something that is an indication of performance, it is a clear indication that the regional government is really having a difficult transition. They have reenacted several budgets as indicated in the report, and like, for instance, the section there in public fiscal management, where Dave really has discussed that when you look at the analysis on public fiscal management, that you cannot also separate that with how the national also is looking at spending, and one of the things really is the difficulty, for instance, of like, say, for instance, a procurement. But more than that, I would also say that the government of the day, the MILF, also has issues, for instance, of how you make social services inclusive, where you do not just particularly favor a particular group, but to make it socially inclusive as well. So these are some of the issues, the challenges the transitional government structure in the BARMM. Dave?
Okay, David.
Yeah, so Yash just focused mostly on the financial aspect of your question, Christian. Let me go in a couple other directions with that. So how well prepared was, and it is still an MILF-led government. How well prepared, has the MILF been, and have they gotten what they need? So, and this will not be surprising to any viewers who are down in southern Philippines. It's not as if the MI leadership sort of just came out of the jungle, so to speak, and set up shop in Cotabato City. The leader, these are leaders in a movement that have been, deeply engaged with the Philippine government, with the international community, with lots of other institutions and organizations in the Philippines as well. So, they were not total neophytes when it came to understanding governance, in the Philippines. So there was that to begin with. That said, there are also there are a lot of other, non-MILF Moros, Muslims, who also, are incredibly well trained and well educated. So there is a question of whether, and we raised this, it's been raised by others, whether the MILF leadership, has drawn enough on non-MILF expertise. and that's sort of subject to debate. But then also, both the Philippine government and international organizations, international donors, again, not just over the last 6 years, but for the last 20 years, have been providing quite a bit of training, and capacity building. And again, not just for the MILF, but for groups more broadly in the region. So there's that as well. And that includes, engagement by universities and that sort of thing. So, has there been enough? I think it's been significant. There could, of course, always be more, but it's been significant. And then, as Yash said, there has been no shortage of resources. This is a very different, and this is important to point out, this is a very different situation from what, the situation that the ARMM, the autonomous region from Muslim Mindanao, faced originally, where they both had very limited resources and no real control over their resources. In the case of the BARMM, they probably have more money than they should have. That was just how that was agreed upon. And it has, one of the ways we've seen with the capacity, it's managing public financial management is a very complicated thing for any government. And again, as Yash mentioned, we see it in the case of the national government as well. So, getting your PFM, your public financial management, working and having integrity and being well targeted, those are difficult things to do. And yes, they still need a lot of work, certainly in that area.
Okay. So again, looping back to my question regarding metrics, and of course, it's understandable that the studies are qualitative, basically. But if we're going to use the BOL, the Bangsamoro Organic Law, as of course, the main basis, can it be said that the transition government has largely complied with the BOL, not just on paper, but in terms of structures that were put up?
Yash, you want to take that?
Yeah. Yash?
I would say there's no. Okay, as you can see, that's why the matrices that we use are actually not just solely on what has been written in the BOL, but also in terms of like how people's expectation of it, and also like the development agenda that is supposedly where the constituency of the regional government also was able to be consulted, and their voices have been written, included in the development agenda. But I would say that when we talk about the spirit of the BOL, is that keywords there is integrative, inclusive, and transformative. And I would say that, for instance, in terms of the education, that's my bias because I'm an educator. There's a very important, I would say it's a landmark value of holistic and balanced education, where you're supposed to integrate values-based, to use a better term in terms of Islamic education, values-based peace education, which is not really something new because we already have this policies at the national level. Like say, for instance, it is mandated by the basic and even by the higher education in the country that we should be able to include peace education in our curricula. And what is being taught in Islamic education is basically how we should be able to govern with moral values. And this is something that the BARMM is really trying to institutionalize, and that is part of their core identity as Bangsamoro, is Islamic education. But in terms of that, you could see from the conversations that we've had, this report is anchored on around 50 interviews with CSOs, including, of course, key leaders in the Bangsamoro, that there's still a lot to go in terms of really institutionalizing a more meaningful, inclusive, transformative education. And this is not, of course, unique in BARMM. Learning crisis is a national crisis in the country, we would say. So as pointed out in the report, and also, what has been kept mentioned by Dave, that we should not isolate the BARMM, like seeing it as something like a silver bullet or as a panacea, to what are the governance challenges that we have at the national level. And so I would say, for instance, that in terms of how the BOL, if if the government of today, for instance, has responded to it, there's the BOL, I would say, is a continuing aspiration. Well, for many non-Moro, non-Magindanaon IP communities, they still need to feel, this kind of development that was promised to them. That was really their battle cry, and it's clearly written in the report that that this governance challenges in terms of how do you operationalize, how do you meet the needs that was clearly been articulated since day one of the enactment of the BOL, when it became a law signed by the previous president and has been implemented and continued by the current administration, remain to be felt and seen, really.
Okay, let's go to a very important challenge that was also covered by your assessment. Because I remember early on, some of the comments that I was hearing early during the transition was that there seemed to be a tendency on the part of the MILF to run the BTA as if it were the central committee of the organization. And of course, later on, there was also this criticism that the transition government seemed to be very, very Maguindanao centric, to the detriment of the interests of the Basulta regions. And how did the transition government actually fare based on your review, David, regarding these issues?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's an important issue, and one that we mentioned. It relates to this larger. I mean, there are a lot of different ways to think about what inclusive government or governance is, and in the case of Muslim Mindanao, one of the most fundamental ways, or one of the most important aspects of that, is how inclusive it is of the various ethnic and regional groups, and our assessment, and this is still somewhat impressionistic, because again there is not very strong data on this, but there are certainly strong views on this, and I think many of them are rooted in reality. But the government has been heavily Magindanaon, and as I said, also in terms of positions, there has been a, not surprising, but there have been prioritization or preferences for people who have been MILF or associated with the MILF. Again, that's not terribly surprising given that they run the government and it's a transitional government. But the Maguindanaon dominance does seem to be an issue, and obviously we've seen the pushback or the reaction to that with what's happened with Sulu and the islands as well. That said, I mean, I think so. Comparing it to the MI running the BTA like the Central Committee, I don't think that's a fair take on it. I mean, the BTA is much more inclusive, and I mean, you look at the Parliament, you look at the process by which laws are passed and rules are made. There are some people who claim it all gets decided in the Central Committee of the MILF. I personally don't believe that's the case. So yeah, there is still a strong MILF Maguindanao influence. That's clearly the case. That said, though, Maguindanao it's a big province, the most populous province. The capital, Cotabato City, is where most government transactions happen. So there are some just inherent reasons why there's a tendency towards that. But I think what a point I think we make or should make is that probably the MI has not done enough to kind of remedy that, both the perceptions and the reality, that they probably needed to be more kind of proactive and more oriented towards kind of trying to address those perceptions and those criticisms.
Okay, let's go to the transition itself in terms of holding what should have been the very first parliamentary elections in that region. It has been twice postponed, and one of the concerns raised during the first and second postponements was that that could trigger further violence in the region. And number two, the absence of a clear mandate on the part of the people for the governing body. These postponements, this extension of the transition government, how exactly have they affected the government itself in terms of delivering on its promises? Have they weakened or perhaps somehow strengthened because of strengthened their governance in terms of basically providing continuity? Yash?
Yeah, I mean, like I would always, like I'm a Democrat by heart, so I believe that, that the election should really push through. I mean, there is really an increased legitimacy on the part of the Bangsamoro Parliament if there's actually mandate from the people, and they are appointed, and the thing is that with the new president, he has again changed the rather reconstituted the BTA, and we observe that there are certain, of course, in governance, politics is very much intertwined, and so because there's no popular mandate, we could see that in terms of the where they are loyal to, is also something where people could put question to. They would have doubt in terms of like whose loyalty or who do you serve in the region. So personalities right now are politics is quite high, like for instance, in terms of like how governance assessment, that's why this, I would say, a modesty aside, that this is the first ever balanced assessment, is that a lot has been said in terms of partisanship, but in terms of like how the BARMM really fared in terms of the governance structure is something that people refuse to talk about. It's because, they're still biased towards or against certain groups that is now dominating the region. And I'm not just referring to the MILF, but I'm also referring, for instance, to the traditional politicians, the local government officials who are right now, building strategic alliances with the government of the day. And so with and so at the governance perspective, people still see it that the appointed members of the parliament do not really have the necessary mandate where they should serve the interests of the public and not just the interests of certain parties or certain personalities that is not necessarily, towards developing the holistic development of the BARMM. And that is now really gets so messy. And of course, with the call for postponement, which is not, it's still a hearsay, because the COMELEC pronouncement is that the parliamentary election pushes through in October. And we are really hoping that by then we could have the historic first ever regular parliamentary elections, which, by the way, according to the BOL, should have been synchronized during the May 22 elections.
David, same question. Has this actually helped the region as a whole, this extension?
My short answer would be, when I was last in the region, let's see, down in the BARMM late last year, so I think it was after the Supreme Court's decision on Sulu being removed from the BARMM. Even before that point, pretty much everything was being driven by the run up to the elections for May of earlier this year, right? And now the elections have been extended to October, and again, we'll see whether they happen. So it's basically been electoral politics for over a year, going on a year and a half now, and that's generally speaking not very good, not good for good governance and for sensible policy making. So, I mean, while I understand sort of understand the need for the initial extension, I think it's damaging to just the functioning of government and for continuity. I mean, there's a sort of a superficial continuity, but everything's so politicized now that I don't think it's a productive situation now.
Okay. Of course, we're still waiting for the elections to happen. They're set. They were reset for October 13.
Yeah.
And of course, one of the things that a lot of people are looking forward to was the strengthening of the political party system, which, if you talk about the national situation in the Philippines, is basically non-existent. Okay, that's a given. But so far, are they getting closer to that? Basically, veering away from personality-centered politics or personality politics to a more party and principle or ideology centric political party system, at least in the BARMM. We haven't seen the election so far, but based on the promises, the platforms, and the actuations leading up to the elections, what are you seeing? Yash.
Of course, political parties are institutions of mature democracies, and just like the rest of the country, and as you have pointed out, Christian, like it's practically non-existent at the national level. Well, I would qualify my answer in as much as at least in the BARMM, there is already that institution, like the Bangsamoro Electoral Code, that mandates. So at least there's the reinforcement of the legal institution that they need to include sectors like women and youth in their political party building. There are, of course, and these are healthy indication that the democracy is very much alive in the bar. Is say, for instance, the voices of young people, women are very much active in terms of mobilizing for political party. Even, for instance, the MILF, United Bangsamoro Justice Party, that they have women nominees in their rank. While it remains to be seen if they will be the dominant political party come October elections, but then we can see that there are, of course, emerging political parties of non-MILF, like say the Merdeka or the Bangsamoro People's Party, which are, of course, coalition of like what do you call this, non-Maguindanao parties that are also competing. So again, I think this is a healthy development in the region, and we are really looking forward that this would set a good example to the rest of the country.
David?
Yeah, tough. Yeah.
You can be brutally honest.
Yeah. Well, no. Well, okay. So the cynical view is, of course, that it's no different, and that the politics in southern Philippines is no different than anywhere else in the country. Maybe just a little more in some ways acutely, but so that money, guns, goons, but dynastic politics, all of those things are very powerful and remain very powerful influences. So kind of the, I don't know, cynical, but sort of somewhere between realistic and cynical is that those dominate and will continue to dominate. So there really won't see much difference. That said, the more maybe it's the unrealistic but hopeful view is that the MI has tried to stand for something. I mean, they have had, we say this in the report, they have had certain aspirations. The UBJP, they've tried to transform the movement into a party. Whether that's how different that's going to be is a big question. As Jas mentioned, there's some other parties that have developed. But then the other point is that these are parties that are competing for seats in a parliament, right? So we kind of also have to wait to see what what parliamentary politics, what impact that sort of, the loop in a sense has for party development as well. And it's, we haven't had the BTA parliament hasn't been a genuine parliament. It's been appointed and dominated by the MILF. So we'll have a different situation in terms of parliamentary government, and that might have interesting implications for party development.
Fair enough. Okay, let's go to this point. I think this is very interesting because of course, there's the saying that the proof of the eating is pudding is in the eating. Let's talk about your assessment of the moral governance call by the BTA leadership. Of course, this was the clarion call, so to speak, by the former interim chief minister, Ibrahim. Okay, you mentioned here that. Of course, it has been too focused on moral governance as its principal tool for combating corruption, and has failed to put in place a variety of processes and instruments that could have been more impactful in preventing, detecting, and punishing corruption. Because to be honest, this is one of the issues I've been hearing a lot of from people in the know, that corruption is actually bad, for lack of a better word. Is that also the feedback that you got during the course of this review? Yash?
Well, obviously, everyone in the country really, abhors corruption, because it really steals the development that every Filipino and Filipina deserves. And at least in the BARMM, that was really, I think, the heart of jihad of every Bangsamoro child, and now the governing entity, that they're fighting for a corrupt-free governance for their children, the sons of the mujahideen and mujahidats and daughters, that there is also equitable access to these resources, because there's already enough resources for everyone, to take part in, and to share. However, I think that was clear in the report as well, that moral governance seemed to be, it just become a slogan in a way, that it did not really it did not translate into actual practice. Well, there are attempts, like, say, for instance, there was a mention in the footnote that there was a member of the parliament who filed for Bantay Corruption Office, that was supposed to be like, not necessarily the counterpart of ombudsman, but in a way that was, at least that was in their heart, that they want to really safeguard the funds and the resources that they are supposed to share, to redistribute to the rest of the people in the BARMM as part of their mandate. But then that particular bill did not become a law, original law in the Bangsamoro. And so, a lot of rhetorics on moral governance, and per our conversation, it is, an empty promise, because it did not really, translate into what was really about transparency and accountability. Because again, like, the, the government of the day, for instance, they are not acting in isolation with the rest of the country, that's for sure. But at the same time, it's also a systemic corruption, systemic. And so a lot of promises has been said, but it did not really transform the region. Like, say, for instance, in the education sector, a lot of, well, I think this is something also that needs to be seriously tackled by the regional government. A lot of allegations of selling of items for DepEd teachers, ghost students in schools, so a lot of funds, really, the malversation of funds, but these are just reported not on a proper forum. And so that has to really be a lot of discourse on this. But in terms of formal or legal complaints, it remained to be actually done. Dave?
Okay, before David answers, basically, I don't even know whether that is a fair assessment. The comment that corruption is bad in the Bangsamoro, because if you
Yeah.
look at the situation across the country, corruption is really bad
Well,
in the Philippines. Okay, so I isolate the Bangsamoro region there. But number two, what are missing? What mechanisms are missing in terms of
sure.
making sure that corruption would at least be more difficult to do
Yeah.
in
Well,
this transition government, David?
sure. Yeah, thanks. So, yeah, just to back up again, there's a lot of money flowing in to the BTA, to the government every year. I mean, they haven't been able to lard the block grant and the special development. It's a lot of money that's been coming in. So there's a lot of money. We've already mentioned there are, weak or underdeveloped systems for public financial management. So that by itself is a problem. But then you get to get to your question, Christian. There's very weak, almost non-existent accountability mechanisms, right? So while the initial interim chief minister and then actually the current one both have. He's also embraced moral governance, right? So it is sort of the theme, the aspiration, and it's commendable as an aspiration. We say that, but there are very few accountability mechanisms. So you begin with the parliament, right? And again, this all, to your point, Kristen, this all applies at the national level too, right? But whether it's the Congress or the parliament, in the case of the BARMM, it's the parliament. There's been very little evident effort for the parliament to exercise any accountability over how the government has spent its money or the quality of its programs, et cetera. Another point we make in the report, and Yash and I both have long histories with civil society organizations, but civil society organizations in the BARMM probably need to be more robust in their efforts to monitor government programs and be critical when necessary. And then we haven't really talked that much about the role of the national government in all of this, but also national government agencies, the Commission on Audit and the Ombudsman's Office, the Department of Finance. They all have certain oversight roles too, and it's not clear that they've necessarily exercised those roles very energetically, and so there's in short there's been and of course there's very little media scrutiny. I mean, in activity or scrutiny down in the Bangsamoro region. So for all of those things that are weak nationally are even weaker, for the most part in the Bangsamoro.
Okay, as a final point, let's talk about the decommissioning process and, of course, the larger normalization phase in this Bangsamoro peace process. How are they faring in terms of, let's say, the decommissioning process? Because there's been a lot of delay and a lot of questions as to the legitimacy or integrity of the decommissioning process. Let's start with Yash.
Well, as you can see, there has, the MILF Central Committee has recently released their official statement that they have halted the last phase of the decommissioning, primarily because the GPH implementing panel failed to deliver the rest of the component that were promised to them in terms of, like, say, not just the laying down of arms, like the 100,000 cash assistance, but also the socioeconomic packages that needs to be given to the MILF families that is in the camps. To our viewers, what is also needs to be emphasized here is the context, the contextual understanding of how an MILF camp is. To be honest, it's not like what you can imagine. It's not a military camp. Like in MILF, the camp is actually, these are communities. And that, as also mentioned in the report, that you have the main camps, or at least the base camps, and then you have the outer influence camps. So these are really big communities. So you can see that when you talk about camp transformation, for instance, which is part, of course, of the decommissioning, that you are also in a way already providing socio-economic services as part of the whole governance mechanisms that is to be provided, not just by the government of the day, but is pretty much tied up to the normalization track. That is part of the two track, the political track, which is the enactment of the BOL and now the BARMM, and you have the normalization track. So the national government fails on that. While this is not something unique, Christian, because you also see this, with the MNLF, that the 1990s final peace agreement, and we have mentioned that, preface that in our report, that we also see the MILF peace process as supposedly part of the unfinished agreement during the 1990s final peace agreement. Well, at least we touched on that, but not really, because these are also two, sensitive issues in the first place, the issue of security. That when you also talk about normalization, every Bangsamoro also wish to anchor socio-economic services or peace to justice. And so in terms of the transitional justice and reconciliation, which is part of the normalization, it was, it never moved. There is no national policy yet on transitional justice, which is part of the normalization track. So it's clear that now we don't see any exit agreement happening anytime soon, because clearly it has failed, at least in terms of the checklist that is supposed to be ticked.
Okay, David.
Yeah, so I'm not as close to the situation as Yash is, so I'll just make one or two limited comments. One is that whatever else happens, or the current situation with normalization and decommissioning, one of the unfortunate things in the current situation is that it's not that it's caused, but it certainly has intensified divisions within the MILF itself. So again, the one of the strengths of I would argue of the transition period has been that the MI remained a, at least generally speaking, unified entity. And I think it appears there are, or will be, well, there are really, I think, kind of divisions now about the future of decommissioning. And that's a pretty significant issue. And then just more generally, from afar, and I am very, very much afar, one gets the sense, and it's not just, more generally, but also as apply, again, national and regional, sort of that there's this sense of drift, and, and maybe the national government, the political situation is distracting people at the highest levels perhaps from the situation going on in the BARMM. And so you've got sort of uncertainty within kind of at the national level, and then you've got these divisions growing within the MILF, and the prospect of elections. It's a unsettled and worrying situation.
Well, David and Yash, thank you very much for joining us today on Facts First. And by the way, for those who would like to get a copy of your report, would like to read that, where can they get a copy? Yash. It's available online, David?
Yes, it's available at the social media page of IAG. They just have to search IAG Research and Publications. And I think by September, limited copies will be available at the IAG office in Manila and Cotabato.
Okay. IAG is the Institute for Autonomy and
Autonomy and
Governance.
Right.
Okay.
In
David
Cotabato.
and Yash, thank you very much again. It's our pleasure and again, a privilege, okay, to have you here in Facts First. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christian. Thanks,
Thank
Yash.
you, Christian. Thanks, Dave. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Yan po. Nakausap po natin sina Yash and David. Sila po yung co-authors dito po sa groundbreaking study kung saan ina-assess po talaga kung ano po ba yung mga successes and failures and of course ongoing challenges dyan po sa Bangsamoro region na kasalukuyan pa rin pong nasa transition. So maigi po na talagang binabantayan po natin yung mga developments dyan. Okay? So yun na po muna. Ako po si Christian Esguera. Magandang araw po. Magandang gabi po sa inyong lahat.